Welcome, everyone, to the third and final episode of the Standard Oil series. We have seen a lot. We've seen the history of Rockefeller, how he built this corporation, molded it in his image, operated as if he was divinely appointed by God to accumulate wealth. Standard Oil, of course, has now dominated the industry. It controls 90% of it. It is effectively the industry, the market, the law in this world. But like all stories, there has to be an end. And all this dominance has attracted enemies, critics, and they are finally ready to take down Standard Oil. In this third episode, we're going to see how the government will finally rise up, make antitrust cases stick, how Ida Tarbell is going to write her own indictment of Standard Oil, and how everything will play out, which I think is going to be slightly surprising once you hear about it, because Standard Oil may go away, but the ideas never quite die. That being said, let's jump in with the next part in our story. Part 6. The Inferior Power. A woman picks up a pen and begins to write. Ida Tarbell, the daughter of a ruined oilman, has spent years piercing together the secrets of Standard Oil. Her words will light a fire that will burn through the halls of government, through the minds of regulators, through the growing anger of the people. The case against Standard Oil has begun. The empire that once seemed untouchable is now on trial. We have seen Ida Tarbell a few times through her story. She grew up in the oil regions. She has a biased perspective of the region. Her father was involved as a refiner, and he did suffer under the Standard Oil consolidation. And she's going to be the person that will most effectively dissect everything Standard Oil has done. Now, before we talk to her, we have to see a little bit of the trends that are going on that allow her to do this. The press has become quite assertive by this point in time in history. Ironically, the gigantic trusts that are taking place in so many different products, not just oil, right? We saw copper and steel and so on, are actually providing lots of revenue to advertisers who are able to then put ads into newspapers and make newspapers much more valuable from an economic perspective. You also have new technologies, including linotype and photo engraving. Glossy illustrated magazines are streamed forth in such numbers that the era will be memorialized as the golden age of the American magazine. And of course, we see a rise of mass circulation newspapers, which cater to the expanded reading public. Now, for the first time in history, college graduates are going to go work on newspapers and magazines, bringing a new literary flair that some part of the world kind of consider beneath the dignity of the educated elite. Ida Tarbell, of course, is part of this huge change in the newspaper world. She was born in 1857 in a log cabin 30 miles from where Drake actually struck oil 2 years later. This is Pennsylvania. And she was a true daughter of the oil regions. She grew up with oil derricks and oil tanks and pipelines, refineries, oil exchanges. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, crafted vats from hemlock bark, a trait easily converted into the barrel making after Drake's discovery. Now, wooden barrels are going to be soon replaced by iron tanks. This will be the first of the several times that Ida's father is going to be hurt by the progress of the industry. And if you remember, Rockefeller and Standard Oil in particular are going to hoard these tanks as a bargaining chip against railroads. Now, in 1872, Ida Tarbell is an impressionable 15-year-old, and she saw her paradise torn by the South Improvement Company. This is sort of the first effort Rockefeller and Standard Oil did to try and consolidate the industry. Her father actually joined vigilantes who sabotage the conspirators' tanks, and she loved to talk about the revolution that was going on at this point in time. And her father did suffer. She talks about him having a change of personality during this time, becoming much more silent and stern. And this bred almost like a lifelong hatred of Standard Oil and Rockefeller by extension. To her, Standard Oil symbolized the triumph of grasping men over decent folk, like her father, who played fair and square. Now, she had done several things before she wrote about Standard Oil, and she was, by all accounts, a fantastic writer. She would then give me the assignment to cover a trust, or at least to cover this rise in trust. And she thought that Standard Oil was actually a great example because it was the biggest. And of course, many other trusts had copied Standard Oil, so why not sort of go after the original? She first had projected this will be 3 issues to explain how Standard Oil works, actually, to comb through all the testimony that has been given in different trials, all the available information, and she will get a chance to talk to some Standard Oil executives, pretty high up, actually. But due to popular demand, the Standard Oil series is actually going to stretch to 19 installments. The first one was released on November 1902. Now, one of the people that she'll get to speak to is Henry Rogers at Standard Oil. He was one of the highest level executives. And she actually visited him periodically for about 2 years at 26 Broadway. And this encounter has kind of had like a quasi-clandestine aura where Rogers will sort of whisker from one door to another and get a chance to react to everything that she was writing. Now, she did a lot of research herself. Again, there was a lot of information out there about Standard Oil, but no one had really pieced it together and understood it in the same way that Ida Tarbell is going to. And then, of course, be able to explain it in the way that she did. People have argued why someone like Rogers actually met with Ida and provided even more information. There's kind of 2 schools of thoughts. Standard Oil, of course, was criticized heavily in the media by this point in time. So perhaps Rogers and Archibald were trying to deflect that to someone else. Maybe even taking revenge against Rockefeller. Maybe, he had felt slighted by Rockefeller during the time. Rockefeller in particular had disapproved of Rogers' stock market speculations. And perhaps he just wanted to talk. Whatever the reason, he did receive Ida Tarbell and he did provide her with confirmations of several things. He didn't talk about everything, but it was enough that then she was able to confirm it with other sources. Now, even if we look at what Ida Tarbell wrote nearly a century later, her series on Standard Oil really remains perhaps the most impressive thing that has ever been written about the company. It was a tour de force of reporting that dissects the trust machinations with an amazing clarity. She laid down this very clear chronology, provided an incredible account of how the trust had evolved, and it made this convoluted history of the oil industry comprehensible. It really remains a great case study of what a single journalist can do if that journalist is armed with facts and is able to just put it all together. Now, she wasn't 100% unbiased. And we have to admit this because her neutrality was never seen. Of course, she is someone in the oil regions. Not only her father suffered, but actually her brother was a leading figure in the forming of something called the Pure Oil Company, which was the most serious domestic challenger to Standard Oil. We have to remember that when we say challenger, we mean, this company was likely producing somewhere around like 5-10% of the capacity. But nonetheless, of all the challengers, this was the most serious, and it was led by Ida Tarbell's brother. She did make several errors in her reporting, right? And there has to be some caution when citing her work. She claimed that Rockefeller actually initiated the South Improvement Company, which wasn't true. It was actually initiated by the railroads. She, of course, saw the Oil Creek drillers in perhaps a higher plane of morality. She said, quote, "They believed in independent effort, every man for himself, and fair play for all. They wanted competition, loved open fight," end quote. But she had to overlook sort of badly anti-competitive agreements proposed by the producers themselves. And far from being sort of free marketeers, many of them actually had tried to form their own cartels to restrict output, control prices. And of course, they all took rebates whenever they could. So it wasn't really some kind of big morality play where on one side you had the good drillers and on the other side you had Rockefeller. They were all trying to make it work in whatever way they could. Rockefeller just ended up being much more effective at the formation of a cartel than anyone else. Now, she was quick to acknowledge the genuine achievements of Rockefeller and actually even devoted one chapter that was called, quote, "The Legitimate Greatness of the Standard Oil Company," end quote. To her, it almost seemed like the unethical actions that Standard Oil had taken ruined the story for her. She wrote, quote, "They had never played fair, and that ruined their greatness for me," end quote. Now, she, of course, put Rockefeller at the center of the story. This is I guess, what is sometimes called the sort of great man approach to history, right? This gigantic trust was given a face, and that was the face of Rockefeller. It kind of dismissed the sort of bureaucratic nature of Standard Oil, the many committees that ruled the organization. And of course, it diminished any other associates that Rockefeller had. Now, it's likely true that Rockefeller had more influence than anyone else. He, of course, had more shares. He had a higher percentage of the dividends. But by this point in time, 1880s into 1890s, this wasn't a single person running an entire organization. There were many different players playing different roles. Now, by the end of her 19-part series, Tarbell had really come to regard Rockefeller as the embodiment of evil. She had maintained a mostly clinical tone despite many of the issues. But after this 19-part series, which again is just overall fantastic, there's some factual errors, but overall pretty good. But then for some reason, after the 19-part series, she was given an assignment, or she volunteered to write what became known as a 2-part character study of Rockefeller. And this is, I think, where whatever she was holding back really came out. And she would write statements such as, quote, Rockefeller is concentration, craftiness, cruelty, and something repulsive, end quote. She described him as a living mummy, hideous and diseased, leprous, reptilian. He thought that he had this pious church-going image that was hypocritical facade, brilliantly created by the predatory businessman. Rockefeller actually, at this point in time, by the late 1890s into the early 1900s, actually came down with a disease called alopecia, where you lose a lot of the hair that you have on your body, including, of course, your head, eyebrows, and so forth. And she seemed to equate this alopecia disease with almost like a punishment from God, that he had been given this disease as a consequence of all the actions that he had taken. During the character study, she also had a conversation with Frank. Again, right, this is Rockefeller's brother, who was highly resentful of Rockefeller. And he provided her with lots of quotes, many of them not factual, but she decided to include them nonetheless. She must have discarded Frank's mental health. He was not someone that likely came across as stable. But again, for some reason in this character study, she just let everything go against Rockefeller. And this is perhaps the biggest mark on her work that she did on Standard Oil, work that was overall quite great, but was diminished by this 2-part character study that she did after it. Now, Rockefeller is not going to rebuke any of the statements made by Ida Tarbell, because to rebuke the few lies, the few factual errors, he would have to rebuke everything else. And of course, he cannot do that. For the most part, he will stay silent. I would say the character study seems to have hurt him the most, as you imagine anyone could. Someone just wrote a sort of 2-part psychological analysis of who you are and taking things like your, disease as some kind of like moral punishment. But he will not say anything publicly. It would just be one of the many things that Rockefeller will just let go and play out in whatever way it might. Around the same time, the government is going to start to ramp up and go after Rockefeller. This is the so-called inferior power that Archibald Rogers and many other Standard Oil executives treated with contempt. Now, to be fair, the government was not that powerful at this point in time. In the 1890s, the entire Justice Department staff in Washington, composed of 18 lawyers, and the authority and power of the federal government, so visible in Washington, was much less visible elsewhere. After the Civil War, the South was thinly occupied by federal forces. Native Americans were still the majority in most places west of the 100th meridian. And the overall shape of U.S. policy would still remain unclear pretty much anywhere west of that. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is going to make trust one of his major domestic policy goals. And he really found Standard Oil to be a perfect trust. It was big, it was rich, it was brutal, it was unpopular. And he adored grandstanding and really liked to use his pulpit to incite a popular fervor. What's intriguing about Roosevelt, he really had this duplicity to what he was trying to do. publicly, he loved to talk about the breakup of Standard Oil and all the trusts, but privately, he was a little bit differently. He was actually reluctant to wield the big sort of government power. If you look at the Sherman Antitrust Act against Standard Oil, he actually preferred compromise to antitrust cases, which he believed were slow, time-consuming, and really quite difficult to win. He wanted to supervise trusts, not break them up and sacrifice the efficiencies. And he was actually searching for any kind of conciliatory overture from his adversaries, especially perhaps if they will accept government oversight and voluntarily mend their ways. But of course, for Archbold, compromise was just not a word in his vocabulary. It's intriguing to think that perhaps if Rockefeller had been in charge, maybe there would have been a private compromise between Standard Oil and the government that's going to avoid many of the things that are going to happen going forward. But again, for Archbold, there is no compromise. It's battle, and here's Standard Oil, this fantastic power in the world, and he's going against what he perceives as an inferior power that really has no say outside of Washington. Now, Rockefeller is actually going to try to disperse of the title that he holds as the president of Standard New Jersey. He's seen the increase in public backlash, of course, with Ida Tarbell's 19-part series, and with Roosevelt increased rhetoric of breaking up the trust. But Archbold is actually going to resist, afraid that Rockefeller's departure might repudiate the organization at what seems like a vulnerable moment and undermine shareholder confidence. And we got to remember, the biggest shareholder in Standard Oil is Rockefeller. His wealth is tied quite heavily into it. He will actually invest his money in a highly diversified manner, and this is still his company. So we can see how, even though Rockefeller wanted to step down, really give away the title and make Archbold the actual president, even since that was his actual role, he will continue to be rejected by Archbold and maintain this honorary title that is just going to continue to haunt Rockefeller. Now, for someone like Rogers, Rockefeller maintained the title seem logical. He said, quote, "This case is against us that are pending in the courts. We told Rockefeller that if any of us had to go to jail, he will have to go with us," end quote. So for Rogers and Archbold, they're concerned about what might happen, and they don't think Rockefeller should just be able to escape from that. Roosevelt is also going to coin the term for journalists like Ida Tarbell of this time. In one speech, Roosevelt talked about supporting journalistic reform, but he also lashed out at the Crusaders for finding nothing good about society and always looking to constantly bring up the negative elements as if raking muck from the ground. This name, of course, became popular, and the journalists of this time became known as muckrackers, who were engaging in muckracking. Now, in November 18, 1906, the federal government is going to file yet another antitrust case, this time in Missouri, to dissolve Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, naming as defendants Standard Oil of New Jersey, 65 companies under its control, and a pantheon of chieftains, including John and William Rockefeller, Henry Flagler, Oliver Payne, John Archbold, and Henry Rogers. Now, the government reported in 1907 that Standard Oil still refined 87% of all kerosene, handled 87% of exported kerosene, and marketed 89% of domestic kerosene, and was more than 20 times the size of its most serious competitor, Pure Oil, which we saw earlier. Now, as the nominal president of Standard Oil, Rockefeller was in a bit of a bind. He was responsible for the actions, some that he had not approved. Remember, by 1907, it had now been about 10 years since he had officially retired from 26 Broadway. In July 1907, he once again pleaded with Archbold to accept his resignation and release him from his torment. He still owned 27.4% of Standard Oil stock, and Archbold once again turned down Rockefeller's request to be released from his nominal title. I mean, in a way, this kind of feels a little tough for Rockefeller, right? It's been quite a while since you have been involved with the company, and the legal cases that are mounting are quite stressful for Rockefeller. The railroad rebates still were a major issue, which was intriguing because pipelines had actually governed the oil business for more than a generation now. But again, the history and the memory of oil rebates, I think, was just too strong. It was such a seemingly unfair move that it was one of the things that the government wanted to focus on in the antitrust case. Now, Rockefeller will again be brought in for testimony, and he will again play his role quite well. In one example, the judge asks Rockefeller, he said, quote, "Mr. Rockefeller, what is the business of the so-called Standard Oil Company of New Jersey?" And Rockefeller responds, quote, "I believe, Your Honor," and then he appears to lose his way. He sort of fiddles with his cane, crosses his legs, then takes a second stab at the answer, "I believe, Your Honor," and then again, his mind wanders as the judge sort of taps his spectacles over his desk in frustration. Finally, Rockefeller seems to be able to concentrate his faculties and replies, "I believe, Your Honor, they operate an oil refinery in New Jersey." And to all the questions that Rockefeller is asked, he'll respond in a very similar fashion, a slow, disconnected style, making his testimony sort of worthless. Now, the testimony was a fiasco for the judge, but a public relations victory for Rockefeller. People now start to wonder, again, in 1907, how could this sweet, bumbling old man have been the evil wizard of the trust? His testimony even received praise from the press. Now, in another case, another judge is actually going to deliver a fine against Standard Oil, in this case, the Standard Oil of Indiana. The fine seemed to be excessive. It was actually the largest fine in American corporate history up to this point, about $29 million. And it was the maximum penalty possible. The judge had issued a $20,000 penalty for each of the 1,462 carloads of oil cited in the indictment. And reporters, of course, struggled to kind of gauge the amount of money and how do you even explain it to people. Now, this fine did not take hold, and another judge actually revoked the fine and actually reprimanded the judge who appointed it just by being too excessive. Nonetheless, the antitrust case from Missouri in 1907 will continue, and just like everything in the Standard Oil world, it will be the most massive antitrust suit of the day. There were 444 witnesses who delivered 11 million words of testimony, swollen by 1,374 exhibits. The entire proceedings filled 12,000 pages in 21 thick volumes. And before it was over, Standard Oil had actually contested 21 state antitrust suits. These are 21 different antitrust suits from Texas to Connecticut, leading one historian to comment, "Never before in the history of the United States has there been so far-reaching a struggle between industry and government." So after fighting for many years in many states, in many antitrust cases, Standard Oil will now have to face a verdict that will change the trust going forward. For the first time in its history, Standard Oil does not hold the power. And when the gavel falls, everything will change. Part 7. The Fracture. It takes 41 years to build an empire. It takes one ruling to tear it apart. The decision comes down in 1911. Standard Oil is no more. The trust, the machine, the order, it is shattered, broken into 34 separate companies. America celebrates, the government has won. And yet, in boardrooms across the country, the newly formed oil companies sit back, recalibrate, and begin the next move. The body has been divided, but the spirit of Standard Oil is still very much alive. Now, we have seen many antitrust cases go against Standard Oil. Eventually, one will stick. A federal circuit court in St. Louis is going to rule the Standard Oil of New Jersey and 37 affiliates have violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The holding company is given 30 days to divest itself of all its companies. Now, of course, these rulings will then get appealed. It will go down all the way to the Supreme Court. And on May 15, 1911, at 4 p.m., Chief Justice Edward White told a sleepy courtroom, quote, I have also to announce the opinion of the court in number 398, the United States against the Standard Oil Company. For the next 49 minutes, White read aloud the 20,000-word opinion, speaking in such a low, monotonous voice that other justices had to lean over and ask him to speak up. In his mumbled, momentous words, White upheld the decision from the lower courts to dismantle Standard Oil, which was given 6 months to spin off its subsidiaries, with its officers forbidden from reestablishing the monopoly, and thus ended the longest running morality play in American business history. Rockefeller, of course, was actually playing golf when he heard of the news from the Supreme Court, and he was always someone to avoid bad news in some respects, or at least in some areas. It is said that actually Rockefeller refused to read the judges' opinions that broke up his empire. And even years later, when he was asked about it, he just never read it. He never knew the words. He, of course, knew the outcome, but he had never read the specific words that were said by the judge when the standard was broken apart. What's, of course, intriguing to know here is that by this point in time, by 1911, the hold of the trust was actually slipping. Many things had been happening now in the world that made Standard Oil less dominant. We, of course, saw the Russian oil. By this point in time, it is actually quite dominant. Other nations are coming online with their own oil, and this is providing even more competition to Standard Oil. And this is competition that Standard Oil just cannot bring under its thumb. In 1909, Congress repealed the duty that had protected the trust from foreign competition. The Secretary of War halted purchase of petroleum products from it, and the president set aside petroleum-rich territory for conservation purposes. In 1907, Standard Oil actually faced a worthy competitor, but not in the U.S. Royal Dutch and Shell were combined into one single corporation. This is a quirky sort of structure, that was 60% Dutch, 40% British, and Royal Dutch Shell, of course, would just be known as Shell today. We saw this company actually multiple times in the Dubai episode, and we actually saw it in the McKinsey episode of all episodes. So Royal Dutch Shell is going to be a quite worthy competitor to Standard Oil abroad. The Anglo-Prussian oil company, of course, is going to find oil in Iran. At home, other areas are going to also discover oil. You're going to see oil in Texas, Oklahoma, California, Kansas, Illinois. And this is going to provide an opening wedge for newcomers. We saw that the trust had actually pumped 32% of American crude oil in 1899. By 1911, its share had slumped to 14%. Even its historic strength in refining dipped from 86% market share to about 70% in the 5 years before the breakup. This is about 1906, 1907. The automobile that's actually going to make the Standard Oil breakup, and Rockefeller in particular, incredibly wealthy, is also going to recast the industry. In 1910, for the first time, gasoline sales are going to surpass those of kerosene and any other illuminating oils. In 1908, William C. Durant is going to launch the General Motors Corporation, and that year, Henry Ford is going to bring out his first Model T. Ownership is going to explode, reaching 2.5 million cars by 1915 and then 9.2 by 1920. Standard Oil of California is actually going to introduce the first filling station in 1907, but the trust is not a pioneer in this area, and the national network of gas stations is going to be too extensive to be monopolized by any single company. The automobile is actually quite intriguing to our story because it was actually going to make Rockefeller far richer in his retirement than at work. And I mean, he was already quite rich when he retired, but the automobile is just going to supercharge that. When he stepped down from Standard Oil in 1887, he was probably worth around $200 million. But thanks to the internal combustion engine, his fortune is going to soar to about $1 billion by 1913. Now, as the breakup continued after the Supreme Court ruled it, there are a few things that are going to become apparent. The first was that Rockefeller was actually quite conservative in capitalizing Standard Oil, and the companies that are going to be spun off from the trust are actually full of hidden assets. So the shares of this standalone companies, and we're effectively going to see the state level companies be broken up, right? So Standard New Jersey becomes its own company, Standard of California, Standard of Indiana, and so on. So all the shares are going to skyrocket after the breakup. The second thing is for some of the companies, their shares were actually depressed by all the antitrust litigation. But with that litigation fully done, they were going to bounce back even higher. This will be particularly true for Standard of New Jersey. And of course, the automobile industry is going to provide even more demand for all the new spun-off companies. Now, in December 1911, Rockefeller will finally be able to jettison the title of president of Standard Oil, but he continued to hold on his immense shares. And as Standard Oil gets broken apart, his shares get converted to individual shares in the individual companies, right? Shares in Standard New Jersey, Standard California, Standard Indiana. So his wealth is just going to skyrocket even more after the breakup. It's helpful to talk about the final years of Rockefeller's life. He really seemed quite to enjoy himself, actually, especially after this antitrust case was finalized in 1911. He would go on to write this memoir book where he talked about his life, partially factual, partially not. It was intriguing that even in this sort of confession box setting, Rockefeller was often voluble instead of candid. His habit of secrecy was just too deeply ingrained. He voiced no regrets about any of the anti-competitive practice that had just been shown in court and proven in court to lead to the breakup of Standard Oil. He seemed incapable of any kind of self-criticism. And I mean, if you just heard Rockefeller talk, Standard Oil was this sort of beloved organization, worshipped by the masses, and perhaps one of the most remarkable organizations in history, which, I mean, again, some of it is partially true. Over this 3-year period where Rockefeller actually gave interviews for this memoir that came out, never once did he actually refer to the 1911 Supreme Court ruling, and he sometimes actually talked about Standard Oil as if the trust still existed. And I believe he actually only referred to Ida Tarbell maybe a couple times. So you see someone that is so deeply trained to not talk about certain things that he could just completely erase them from any kind of chronological history. His charitable giving is going to also increase during this period in time, partially, of course, because the wealth is going to increase quite exponentially during this time, and just because he sort of formalizing and professionalizing the given out portion of his life. We're going to see the establishment of the Rockefeller Foundation. The bulk of the money he actually gave away went into medicine, and he had significant influence in the world of scientific medicine and how it was accelerated by many of the gifts. He, of course, revolutionized philanthropy in some respects. He created this very formal way of approaching gift giving, a model that would eventually be copied by different foundations in today's era. It seemed like before Rockefeller came along, rich manufacturers tended to promote orchestras and art museums or schools or bequeath buildings like hospitals, dormitories, and orphanage. But Rockefeller was much more interested in the creation of knowledge, specifically scientific medical knowledge. And that may be why his money perhaps had a bigger impact as that knowledge eventually just compounded in different ways. Now, Rockefeller was incredibly healthy. He actually had several health issues, especially when he was involved with Standard Oil and during that period of time where there were several legal troubles. But after that, he really seemed to have fantastic health. By 1922, Rockefeller had lost his parents, his 4 brothers and sisters, his wife, his eldest daughter, 2 grandchildren, and the vast majority of his old business partners. But he just kept going. He actually really believed that he was going to live to be 100 years old. It seemed to be like a final sign from God if he could make it to 100. He's not going to quite make it there, but he'll be very close. I think at the very beginning of episode 1, I talked about how he sort of entered life in a bit of a Benjamin Button backwards manner. Rockefeller had clearly had eschewed any kind of adolescence by becoming or being forced to become a man at a very young age, going, take a job at 16 and taking a very serious life for the next 30 years, 40 years. And now that a lot of the pressure seems to be gone, he seems to be kind of reversing. He kind of adopted this very carefree childhood life, basically. He grew younger in spirit. He started to wear extensive wardrobe of sort of like very colorful clothes. He owned stylish suits, several hundred ties, sometimes changed outfits 3 times a day. He squired ladies. Again, this is after his wife has died. He squired ladies to concerts and dances at the Ormond Beach Hotel. He would go to the opera, the Governor's Ball. He developed kind of like weird behavior, where he would like take off his shoes and put his feet on the table in like a playful manner. His image also changed publicly. We saw that definitely towards that end of the antitrust legislation. For many people, it was like, how could this old bumbling man actually be the evil wizard behind the Standard Oil. And then that sort of accelerated, especially once sort of the Standard Oil Trust went away. In the 1920s, sort of the America worshiped money. And of course, no one was more reflective of that than Rockefeller. Whatever he did seemed to be in the past, in the 1880s, 1870s. He was, of course, a sort of self-made man, which had a positive virtue by this point in time. Many of the corporations were actually being run now by salary managers and corporate bureaucrats, not so the sort of the first generation industrialists like Rockefeller. And of course, he was now more associated with his philanthropy than with Standard Oil, which was broken up, 10 years earlier. The press that was once so hostile to him became some of his biggest supporters. Now, he seemed to reject still certain things. It is said that actually it's possible that Rockefeller probably never set foot in the Rockefeller Center, the building that, Rockefeller provided the money for. On July 8, 1935, he reached 96, and his insurance company, which still functioned by this old custom, actually paid him $5 million, the face value of his policy. And according to the contemporary actual tables, only one person in 100,000 lived to be that long. Now, death remained an unmentionable subject for Rockefeller. He never spoke of death in relation to himself, and he always kind of spoke about life in terms of activity, of accomplishment. His wife was actually quite sick in the final few years of her life, and it seemed like he had a hard time coping with that and just seeing someone die, even though he seemed to be surrounded by death all the time. I mean, he's so full of vitality, and people around him are sort of dying as time goes on. There's a story, actually, the one day Henry Ford was leaving one of the Rockefeller mansions, and Rockefeller said to him, "Goodbye, I'll see you in heaven." And Ford replied, playfully, "You will, if you get in." Now, about 6 weeks short of his 98th birthday, Rockefeller had a heart attack. He lapsed into a coma, and he died in his sleep. The official cause of death seemed to be a hardening and inflammation of the heart wall, although it's probably more accurate to say that he just simply died of old age. He drifted off peacefully, and it is said that perhaps that quiet end to his life may have disappointed whatever critics were still around of Rockefeller who were hoping for perhaps some earthly retribution. And let's just say, it's possible that whenever Rockefeller made it to the other side, he was greeted as so much good had come out of Rockefeller's money, and even perhaps some of the actions under Standard Oil had made some progress that still succeeds today. Now, we have one more part before we finish the story. The monopoly is shattered, the trust is gone, but power never truly disappears. It only finds a new form. And while Standard Oil's name will fade, its legacy is really just the beginning. Part 8. The Shadow Empire. The name is gone, the monopoly is broken, and yet the oil still flows. The companies born from Standard Oil grow larger, stronger, more global. You'll recognize some of the names: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron. The names change, but the power remains. The empire has not died, it has just simply evolved. Rockefeller's vision, his divine ledger, his discipline, it still shapes the world today. The lesson is clear: you can break the body, and the spirit will find a new form. It's helpful to look at what happened after the breakup. We saw a little bit of that, with the bump in stock prices, the introduction of gasoline, the rise of automobiles. We, of course, saw Rockefeller's quite enjoyable life, actually. Those last maybe 30 years of his life were, I think, almost like a reward, one can say, for everything that had gone through before. But for the companies, they do continue on. Now, we know between January and October 1912, the shares really increased rapidly. Here's one example. The Standard Oil of New Jersey zoomed from about $360 to $595. Standard of New York went from $260 to $580. Standard of Indiana went from $3,500 to $9,500. And all of this led to higher wealth for the companies and, of course, for Rockefeller himself. An amazing statistic at this time, actually, is that Rockefeller's net worth reached a lifetime peak of about $900 million in 1913. And to put that into perspective, the total accumulated national debt of the U.S. at that time, in 1913, was $1.2 billion. Rockefeller could just basically pay off the U.S. national debt. Now, Standard Oil of New Jersey remained the world's largest oil company, second only to U.S. Steel in size among American enterprises, and retaining about 43% of the value of the old trust. Now, 5 of the newly divested companies stood among the country's 200 largest industrial firms. Now, old habits die hard. The executives of Standard Oil, like Archbold, actually quietly worked to undermine the dissolution after 1911, suggesting that the officials of the individual companies actually still meet at 26 Broadway at 10:30 each morning to maintain amicable relations and swap information. Now, for legal reasons, of course, everyone was cautioned not to exchange thoughts on paper. Standard Oil of New Jersey was headed by Archbold, and Standard Oil of New York was headed by Folger, and they actually kept their headquarters in the same old building, which, of course, kind of says much about the relationships. Over the next 10 years, the breakup kind of seemed like a sham. The Standard companies continued to divide the country into 11 marketing territories, selling the same brand names and not competing on prices. One has to understand this from one perspective. These are people who have been working together for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and they're now being forced to work separately, but they're also so intertwined, right? They have kind of grown up to be independent but complementary units. They have divided territory, they have divided responsibilities, and it just doesn't just change overnight. So one can see how perhaps some of the momentum that many of these companies had continue on as these men were now in technically separate legal entities, but they were still the same people, still operating in the same world, and in some cases, of course, still working at the same buildings. Now, the children of Standard Oil are really going to be around everywhere. Let me give you some examples of how they're still around in slightly different names. The Standard Oil of New Jersey is going to rebrand as Exxon in 1973. Standard Oil of New York is going to rebrand as Mobil in 1963. And of course, Exxon and Mobil are going to merge in 1999. One can say that, perhaps working at the same building in New York made this merge inevitable. Standard Oil of California is going to merge with another company called Gulf in 1985 and then be renamed as Chevron. Texaco, which was actually a chain of gas stations, will be acquired by Chevron in 2001. Standard Oil of Kentucky will be acquired by actually the Standard Oil of California and will become part of Chevron. The Ohio Oil Company is going to rebrand as Marathon in 1952. U.S. Steel is going to acquire Marathon and actually will divest it again in 2001. Standard Oil of Indiana is going to rebrand as Amoco in 1985. And BP is going to acquire Amoco. BP is also going to acquire Standard Oil of Ohio. The Continental Oil Company will rebrand as Conoco. Conoco will be acquired by DuPont. DuPont is going to divest it, and Conoco will be rebranded as ConocoPhillips in 2002. The South Penn Oil Company will rebrand as Pennzoil, and this will eventually be acquired by the Royal Dutch Shell Company. And there are about 24 other companies. There'll be other stories. Vaseline will get acquired by Unilever. Warren Buffett's company is going to acquire this sort of tank car company from Standard Oil. So the history is interconnected, as we have always seen. Now, with hindsight, in our modern times, we can see that by the time the breakup came in 1911, the dominance was slipping in refining, in the extraction of oil, not just domestically, but globally. In addition, the demand for petroleum products was really increasing more rapidly than the ability for Standard to expand. And especially if we look at the new regions, like California, like the Gulf Coast, the dominance of Standard Oil was really quite weakened by 1911. Now, ExxonMobil is probably the closest thing we have today to Standard Oil, right? They were the two strongest companies in the Standard Oil mix, New Jersey and New York. They merged together. So one, we can say that perhaps if you're looking for any kind of modern-day remnant of Standard Oil, then ExxonMobil is your closest bet. Now, antitrust legislation has continued on to this day, and it's still actually used today, even though, of course, we don't talk about trust anymore. A company like Google and Facebook are not trust and are holding companies. Now, Standard Oil is likely one of the most successful antitrust cases in history. One can say that perhaps the law has not been as effective as original design, but there have been a few other cases where the antitrust case has succeeded from the government's perspective. 1984, AT&T was compelled to divest its regional Bell operating companies. This led to the breakup of its monopoly over U.S. telephone service. We're, of course, not going to hear about landlines, not mobile phones. In 2001, Microsoft was accused by the Department of Justice of maintaining a monopoly in the PC market by imposing restrictions on manufacturers and users, preventing them from uninstalling Internet Explorer, the browser, and using competing products like Netscape or Java at the time. Again, by this point in time, Chrome, Firefox were not around. The court ruled that Microsoft actually violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, but instead of a breakup, a settlement was reached where Microsoft agreed to share its application with third-party companies and appointed a panel to oversee compliance. Today, of course, Internet Explorer is not the dominant browser, it's Chrome, and that naturally leads to antitrust rumors for Google. Now, there's several antitrust cases going on right now. I mean, there's always antitrust cases going on, but again, they're very difficult to win. Theodore Roosevelt was right. These cases are difficult to win. You need sort of overwhelming force, a little bit of luck, and perhaps compromise from the companies themselves is the more likely bet for regulators. Now, a few cases are ongoing. Amazon was sued by the FTC and 17 state attorneys, alleging that the company is a monopoly that uses anti-competitive and unfair strategies to maintain its power. Specifically, it stops rivals and sellers from lowering prices, degrade the quality for shoppers, overcharge sellers, stifle innovation, and so on. Google, of course, has an active antitrust case right now in its digital advertising technology market, and it's trying to get Google to sell off part of its ad tech business. I also believe that's a case that's trying to get Google to spin off its Chrome browser. Apple also has an antitrust case going on right now, specifically around the App Store and preventing other users from putting apps, and specifically how Apple charges within the App Store itself. That is, Apple charges a commission for any purchases that go through apps. Live Nation and Ticketmaster also have an antitrust case, especially after the Taylor Swift tour. The Department of Justice is trying to file a case that Live Nation is a monopoly and it leads to a worse experience for consumers. The challenge with antitrust cases is the Department of Justice is trying to argue that these companies lead to a worse outcome for consumers in some tangible way. But for some of them, let's say like Google, it's a little more difficult to say because Google kind of gives away all the stuff for free, right? Google Maps, Gmail, Google Docs, and so on. So are consumers worse off because of Google? Maybe, yes, right? They're the harder cases. Standard Oil at the time, even though they had lowered some prices for kerosene and other products, they also had excessive profits. And it just seemed like the public was much more willing to say, yeah, this is not good for us, even though perhaps that was not completely aligned with reality. So the antitrust cases continue. Again, just overall quite difficult for the government to establish them. But it is fascinating to me, of course, that we still talk about antitrust, even though we're not dealing with trust. Of course, all these companies are not trust and not holding companies. But the spirit of Standard Oil remains every time we hear an antitrust case be filed by the Department of Justice or the FTC or some other governmental entity. So we may say the Standard Oil is dead, but long live Standard Oil. And that's it for the Standard Oil series. I really hope you enjoyed this 3 episodes. My name is Ruben Ugarte. There will be one more email next week with the bonus content from the series. You can go on the website, stratagems.ca, give your email or not give your email, it's up to you. Either way, I highly recommend you check out that bonus content. It's always quite helpful to kind of see some of the behind the scenes of the podcast. I record a short audio talking about it, the things that stood out to me, the things that were difficult, the things that were fun. And of course, there's always videos and links and articles in the bonus content that can provide more context and just add another level of richness to the series that we just went through together. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any comments, let me know by email. I will also, of course, appreciate if you can take 20 seconds to leave a review in the Apple Store, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the podcast. That's always helpful to myself, to other readers, and to the future episodes that will be coming soon. Just like before with the Dubai episode, I'd like to take a break, maybe about 4 weeks as I work on the next episode. I'm already working on the next episode. I'm excited to release it. It's going to be, I think, a bit unusual, but another great story of an organization that has shaped the modern world, perhaps in a way that we may not think about it, but you should definitely stick around for that. So the next episodes will be live sometime in the next month or so. So be on the lookout for those updates. Until next time, we'll talk soon.